Okay, looks like we're recording. So thanks, Dr. Roy Baumeister, for talking to me today. And I am going to ask you a bunch of questions that people from Narrate have asked. So we're kind of in the middle of this series, The Power of Bad, after your book. And so these questions are from people who've maybe listened to Adam's message or started reading the book or have already read the book. So we're kind of everywhere, or someone might be walking in and seeing this for the first time. So just as an intro, can you quickly just give us a 30,000 foot view of your research and the power of bad?
Sure. I don't know about the 30,000 feet, but The Power of Bad is a book that was based on a scientific review article I did a few years ago, where I sort of noticed a pattern that psychologically people seem to respond more strongly to bad things than to good things. And nobody had noted the general pattern. A few people had noted it in specific areas, specifically with impression formation. When you meet somebody new, if you learn something bad about them, it has a much bigger effect on your impression than if you learn something good about them. Economists had also noted something like that, what they called loss aversion, that when people are making financial or investment decisions, they're more affected by losing money than by gaining the same amount of money. So you're more upset about losing $100 than you're happy about gaining $100. And so it skews the decisions that people make. So these have been somewhat noted in these areas, but there were lots and lots of others. So if you have a good day, you feel good, a bad day, you feel bad. But if it's a good day, the next day you start over, whereas the bad day somehow carries over and affects the next day. Or in relationships, it's the bad things that couples do that have the lasting impact. Not, I mean, good things help, but not nearly as much. When they're trying to predict statistically which couples will break up and which will stay together, it isn't the amount of happy times and so on. It's really the negative things predict much stronger. Criticism affects people much more than praise. I know many colleagues who are professors who can hardly bear to read their course evaluations, even though they're about 95% positive. Everyone's saying they're great, but a few nasty things in there somehow are much more memorable than all the, thanks, it was a great course, I learned a lot. And so I started to see this may be a general property of the mind. And I worked with some colleagues to develop to scour research literature in different areas. We had a bunch of theories about what the exceptions would be, because that'll know what makes the theory most interesting. If you can say, well, bad is stronger here, but good is stronger in these other areas. So that gives us a clue of why bad is stronger. Only we couldn't find the exceptions. It just seemed to be true everywhere. And so there must be something deeply rooted in evolution and a property in the mind that goes way back. Now, my colleague John Tierney, he said he'd noticed the same thing in journalism, right from the first story was about some weather thing, and his editor kind of pushed him to talk about it as a crisis. And over time, he realized everything has to be a crisis. But that's what sells newspapers and magazines. If you say, oh, maybe there's a little problem developing here, that's not going to get people excited. But oh my God, the sky is falling, it's going to be a disaster. That's again what drives their business. So he said, there's an irony in our society is that the best-selling books and the magazine articles and the hot stuff you hear on the news or read in the news lines, they're all about there's going to be some disaster. It's all falling apart. Whereas he says, look, objectively, life is just getting better and better. This is like the greatest time in history to be alive. Even with the pandemic, compared to sicknesses in the past, this is remarkably mild. And, we have so many wonderful things to do and technology and we live longer, better lives, eat better, have better sex, better everything. than in the past. I remember, I think it was Ben Franklin who said, if people could just solve the toothache, everyone would be happy forever after. And think what it was like before dentistry. Your teeth. Most adults only had a few teeth left. In the Civil War, they had trouble signing up soldiers because you had to have at least 6 teeth that were facing each other, because you had to bite off the thing to load the rifle. And lots of soldiers didn't, or lots of recruits didn't even have 6 teeth together. And having a toothache for weeks at a time, that was just part of life. And now we've solved that, but we're not living in euphoria. We just find new things to worry about and complain about.
I just read the chapter 9 in your book, Crisis, and the three assumptions were so interesting. The world will always be in crisis, or the world will always seem to be in crisis. The crisis is never as bad as it sounds, and the solution could easily make things worse. And I think just looking at the news in the world just through those 3 assumptions, it completely changes your kind of perspective.
It does, yes, yeah. John's been thinking about those things for a long time, and those are great ideas.
Yeah. So not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions dealing with COVID and the pandemic. So in your view, how can an awareness for and an acceptance of the power of bad impacted our national response to COVID?
Well, I've been saying all through it, I mean, yes, there's a disease, and yes, some people are dying from it. So it is a problem. So the focus on the negative is causing us to respond in excessive ways. Now people debate back and forth about the lockdown as the response to it, but this is a strong candidate for being in the category of the third point, which is the response may be worse than the original problem. More people may be dying, not from COVID, but because they're not going out to have their cancer checkups or their heart checkups and do all sorts of things. So the diseases that really do kill people at all ages may spread more and account for more deaths than we have saved by means of the lockdown. And that's not to mention the potential economic damage, which, when there's economic downturn, again, health goes down, suicide rates go up, depression goes up. So there'll be lots of negative effects of our response to it. There's no way to evaluate this against how many lives are we actually saving. And the numbers in terms of how bad COVID is seem repeatedly to show it's not as bad as we feared, and all the worst case predictions, which often are what drive policy. And again, that's part of the power of bad. You focus on the worst case scenario and respond to that. Evolutionarily, that was probably a sensible way to go. You're walking through the forest at night and you hear something. Well, maybe it's a tiger. And so take precautions. Responding to the worst case may have made sense then, but in this case, it may well be doing more harm than good.
Switching a little bit, Dustin K asked, how ingrained is the power of bad in America's politics, and maybe more obvious in America's media?
It did seem to turn up under Trump, but I don't know. I mean, his point was this is part of the media and has been for a long time. If it bleeds, it leads, was one of the slogans in journalism, which, again, front page news. And I don't blame the media. They're in business to sell people what they want. And so that's what consumers will buy, a more balanced media outlet that focus more on good news. And people say they want that, but will they actually pay for it? that becomes a question. I think, well, let me put it this way. The old city newspaper really had to appeal to everybody. And so there was an effort to be balanced. And most cities couldn't afford a lot of different newspapers. And so they had one or two. I mean, I lived for many years in Cleveland. And there were two, and then the afternoon one went out of business. So there was just one. To stay in business, they had to appeal to everybody and have editorials for both sides and so on. But as we know, the newspapers have gone largely out of business, and people are getting their news from the media, where they have a much bigger choice of sources, and so they choose ones that suit their political views. Um, and that means that catering to their fans, which are polarized, is the best business strategy for them, and that may increase with demonizing the opponents and explaining how awful they are and focusing on their bad things. That gets people excited. And in fact, I started to think, I'm going to stop reading the news. You get up in the morning and you just end up feeling upset. Mm-hmm. It's not a good outlook to the day. I remember back when I was at freshman at Princeton, I had no contact with the outside world at all. I didn't know what the news was. I didn't follow it, and those were very happy years. Mm-hmm. And so I lived in intellectual life and worked with big ideas. And so I'm thinking maybe I should just go back to that. And the daily news is just depressing. Mm-hmm. In terms of politics, well, there's that too. Everybody deplores negative campaigning, and this goes back to before Trump. People would say, "Oh, well, we're not going to have a negative campaign," and so on, but it works. And right. So they ended up coming in, especially in a close election, saying what an awful person your opponent is and what a disaster it would be for the city or the state or the country if this person were elected. That does get people riled up and gets them going out to vote for your side. It's easier to tear down than to build up the good. Mm. I mean, we know even in religion, and John knew more about this than I did, so I studied American studies, but the preachers who spoke of hellfire and damnation, they were the ones that featured in the great religious revivals in American history, because they were the ones who would get people excited and draw the crowds and stuff. And over time, there'd be a disinclination to talk about hell and all the negative stuff. And so people would switch to a more positive message. And a lot of the mainline churches have gone toward building self-esteem and stuff like that. And then the congregations drop, and then someone else comes along and preaches the fire and brimstone and damnation, and that attracts people again. There's even evidence that the effects of religion on behavior are stronger for the religions that emphasize a punishing God and the dangers of hell and all that. The more, in some ways, more appealing, positive gods who's just all love and everything's good and everyone's going to heaven. That seems like a nicer message, but it doesn't seem to resonate with the deep layers of the psyche, and that's another instance of the power of bad.
Mm-hmm. That was one of my questions on here. If you could speak to that negativity effect within religion. So that section of the chapter, I can't remember which chapter it was really kind of scary when you're working for a church, to think that the angry kind of negative God would be more effective. It was kind of scary. So
in many parts of social science, and certainly not all, in many parts of social science, religion has sort of a bad rap, and I think that's unfair and inappropriate. And not to deny the nasty things that have happened, people burned at the stake and so on.
Yeah.
But the good has far outweighed it. Now, I'm not religious, but I respect religion. Psychologists are notably non-religious, and so many are very skeptical, and it's easy for them to make a negative case about religion because there have been major bad things done in the name of just about all of them and major gods and so on. But I think it's another case where the good has really outweighed the bad, even though it's not. It's just because there's a lot more of it. Religion has done an enormous amount of good in the world, and if you focus on a few massacres or wars of religion and so on, well, yes, there have been some terrible things, and it's hard to compare them with the improvements of daily life among people who share the same faith and share the same ideals and follow their scriptural guidelines. So religion has really, I think, done enormously much more good in the world than bad. But much of it is at this lower, less dramatic level.
Let's go to this question. What's your view of psychotherapy in light of the emphasis it puts on past hurts?
I'm a research psychologist, and I don't. I've never done therapy. I'm not qualified for that. It's not for me. I just published a study. It was not about this in particular, but we were looking at people's thoughts as they go about their daily lives. We sort of beep them at random and say, okay, what was the last thought you had? And we got the time span. And so the more their thoughts were just focused on the here and now, the happier they were. That as their thoughts roamed into the future, or especially the past was the biggest downer. I think people who are still moping and unhappy about things that happened in the past, that does kind of drag you down. And rumination and depression, a lot of those things are past oriented. The future was sort of mixed, but staying right here in the present was the happiest. This is what the people who teach mindfulness advocate. Be here now.
I was just recently reminded of how much stress that we have that comes from events in the future that never actually happen. You just reminded me of that I was asked, I was in this class and I said, well, how many of you are stressed? Okay, everyone's stressed. How many of you are stressed about things that aren't going to happen? Everyone. So that's like where a lot of our stress comes from, is that future worst case scenario. Yes. And I like your reminder of staying in the present and getting out of that could happen, but right here and right now, this is where we're living. Yes. That's a good reminder.
Yes. I had a friend in graduate school who was constantly stressed out and miserable. And as far as I could tell, he'd led a charmed life. These things he was always worrying about hardly ever materialized. And great things would happen one after another. Yes, it's worrying about disaster in the future that really spoils a lot of the pleasure in the present.
What are some things you've learned from your research that you use on a day-to-day basis? What are the fundamentals that you use day to day?
I would say this. It did in terms of relationships.
Yeah.
First, try not to do any bad things. I've always I gave up a long time ago on trying to save the world. So the people who are saving the world are often making it worse. And I don't think I know enough that I can be sure that I can do it. And I decided I want to pursue the truth and come to an understanding. But then I come to a general understanding of what human life is all about. And for a general understanding, it's better not to have strong preferences, because the world is not the way we imagine it to be. And so if you have like strong political views, it's hard to be a good scientist, because you will very much want the results to turn out this way and not that way. And it just slows you down from seeing that, well, a lot of the time it's not the way you want. So instead, my approach is I'm going to look to the people who are connected with me in some way. And I think, well, can I make their life a little bit better in some way, so that they're a little bit better off. So it's much less ambitious than saving the world, but you can pump out. It's much more doable. You can pump out positivity, and some people, there's limited amount you can do. You have a student who's not too talented. Well, you do the best you can with him or her, and again, just the idea. And I say this as a hedonist. It's not a moral thing. Just this is a very satisfying way to live. And if you just try to make all the people in your world a little bit better off because of their connection to you, again, that mostly leads to a good life. So I approach things that way. And in relationships, avoid doing the bad things, and then do lots of little good things. And well, that's a good approach. Think from time to time, what could I do to help this person, or make that person's life a little better.
I like that, because you can't. I mean, there are world changers, but realistically, most of us have a circle and we interact with these people. And how do you make that better? It seems far more doable and tangible for a lot of us. Who's around you and how can you make their life better? I love that.
Yeah.
That answered one of my questions too. It reminds me too of this quote on the back of my on my chalkboard, and it says, every human interaction gives you a chance to make things better or make things worse. So I like that.
I was trying to read that around your head.
Oh yeah, it's the Barbara Brown Taylor. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for talking with me and sharing, and this is really great. Thank you so much.
Okay, good.
Whew. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Roy Baumeister. He is a character. I really enjoyed chatting with him. So thanks if you submitted questions. It was really helpful to have those, and thought it was a good discussion. So I've got like 10 minutes. And originally I wanted to sum up everything that I've been learning about the book and my interview, and I realized I only have 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk about one thing that's been challenging me and I've been working on in these past several weeks. And it's this idea about bonding over negativity. And so what I mean by bonding over negativity, let me just give you some examples, actually. So here's some examples from my week, what I say when I mean bonding over negativity. So last Sunday, we watched the Super Bowl. And so the first part of the week, I had a lot of interactions. It started with, hey, did you see the game? Did you watch the Super Bowl? And every single time, my response was, oh my gosh, it was so boring. Never mind that I never watch football games anyway. Like, I'm only there for the food and to see people. That's it. And we had a great time. We went over to a friend's house. We watched the game with some great friends and had some good food. So why was it my tendency, my first response, to say, oh, the game was so boring? I also, last weekend, Scott and I took 7 high schoolers down to Island Park, Idaho, for our winter retreat. And of course, when I got back at the first part of the week, had several interactions, and people said, hey, how was your winter retreat? And my first response was, the roads were so terrible on the way back. They were snow-packed, icy. I was going like 35 miles an hour. It was so cold. Like, never mind that we had an awesome few days. We played board games and we cooked meals. We went skiing and sledding and we watched Disney movies. The Airbnb we stayed at had this huge collection of like original Disney movies that we really got into. Never mind, we had such a great weekend. So why was it my first response to say, like, the one negative thing? This kind of idea about bonding over negativity really started a few weeks ago when we had the high schoolers over. So we get to have a group of juniors and seniors over every Wednesday night. And for the past several years, Scott and I have been hanging out with high schoolers for a couple years now. We like to do this icebreaker called Happy Crappy or Highs and Lows. It's a really terrible name for an icebreaker where we go around the room and we each say one positive thing about our week and one negative thing about our week. So we got comfortable, we were settling in, and we started to go around the room, and one of the students spoke up. And she is very quiet. She never, hardly ever participates kind of in the group conversation. And she said, I feel like we get enough negativity and we get enough bad just in our week and in our conversations. I think it'd be great if we could just focus on the positive for these 10 minutes. I would love that. And so we looked around the room and we said, oh, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And so ever since, we've done our icebreaker, and we call it highlights. We go around the room and we just share 2 or 3 positive or really good things about our week. And I've noticed that it's really just brightened and elevated that conversation. So thinking about bonding over negativity, I thought, I'm going to do an experiment. And in my head, I called it a social experiment. I'm going to, for a few weeks, observe Scott and my interactions when we get home from the workday. So we both go to work, we get home in the evening about the same time. And I wanted to observe if our first interaction was negative or our first interaction was positive, and then how it affected ensuing conversations. So I did this for a few weeks. And I did tell him later, eventually, that I was doing this, and I asked if I could share this, and he said yes, so we're all good. So if we got home and one of us said something negative, and it didn't have to be super negative. It was usually me complaining about someone cut me off, or I got stuck behind someone going slower, or if we got stuck in the long line at the grocery store, or my podcast didn't download, or something bad that happened during our day. If that was the first thing that was mentioned, it was so easy for the other one of us to go, oh my gosh, yes, and this negative thing happened. And it was so easy for us to get kind of caught up in this negativity spiral of a conversation where we just started comparing the bad stuff that had happened. On the other side, if our first interaction was positive, and it didn't have to be something crazy, it could have just been hey, it's great to see you. I'm glad you're home. This awesome thing happened today. If our first interaction was positive, our conversation was elevated. The quality of our conversation for the rest of the evening was just better. And so it got me thinking about the ratio that he talks about in the book, this 4-to-1 ratio. And I think Adam talked about it last week. I don't know, I was in Idaho driving on terrible roads. So he talked about this, in the book at least, he talks about this ratio 4-to-1, where the baseline of a good relationship is you want to have 4 good interactions to 1 bad interaction. And so I started thinking about, well, what does it look like to have that negative interaction? We can focus on the positive, but what does it look like to talk about the bad? And Gay said it so well in a staff meeting last week, and she said, what does it look like to give voice to grief? What does it look like to give voice to bad? Because we're humans, life's not perfect, and it's not always positive. And there are things in marriage and relationships and friendships and parenting and with other students, there are things we have to talk about. There are things you have to address. So what does it look like to give voice to this grief? And just my observations and my thoughts this week, there were a few things that I kind of landed on. I thought it seemed like if we really worked on that ratio, if we really focused on positivity and putting positivity first, the bad will come. Scott and I, when I was doing this, experiment, it's not like we never had serious, hard conversations around bad or negative, but it felt like because we had focused on the positive, that space was safer almost to talk about the negative. Even further, I realized a lot of the negative that I say or speak just doesn't need to be said or doesn't need to be processed. I don't need to process getting cut off in traffic. I don't need to process hitting every red light on the way to work. That's not something that I even need to process within the context of a relationship. So I guess overall, my thoughts and where I landed this week was just really focusing on how we're interacting with people and just working really hard on pulling out those positive and good interactions, because the bad will come, and there are things we need to process, and there are things that we need to talk about, yes, but if we can focus on just more good and more positivity, I think it seems to, at least in my opinion, create a safer space for that bad and that negativity that needs to be processed like within the context of a safer place. So I'm just going to read, I found this section out of Proverbs. I want to read this, and I'll pray, and the band's going to come up and lead us in one more song. A gentle response diffuses anger, but a sharp tongue kindles a temper fire. Knowledge flows like spring water from the wise. Fools are leaky faucets, dripping nonsense. God doesn't miss a thing. He's alert to good and evil alike. Kind words heal and help. Cutting words wound and maim. God, thanks so much just for this time and this space to process what it looks like to interact with each other in positive ways, and what does it look like when we have to interact around bad or negative. Thanks for just my conversation with Dr. Baumeister and the wisdom that we can take from that video. Just bless us as we go forward, and bless our conversations. We love you. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.